For more, let's go to Bristol. Carlo Bonura, Senior Teaching Fellow at London's School of Oriental and African Studies, SOAS. Thank you for speaking with us here on France 24.
Thank you for having me.
First of all, what do you make of those initial exit polls?
Well, in many ways, the election has gone the way the polling prior to the election has predicted it would. I think it's interesting to note that Prabowo appears to have picked up the undecided voters that existed in the polling. And with 80% of the turnout of 80%, it's a substantial number of voters took part in what was a highly polarized election and a very heated campaign. The two candidates were not very far apart on a number of the core issues, but I think that Indonesian voters appear to have voted for the status quo, both in terms of the presidential election and also it appears at the legislative level as well.
Yeah, 5 years ago, Jokowi was far from being the status quo. He was someone from outside of the usual elites who was coming to power, and he was championed by those who espoused more liberal values. What do you make of the fact that he took this cleric, Maruf Amin, as his running mate on his ticket?
I think this was part of a very well-calculated election strategy. He knew that Prabowo, with the help of the Islamic Defenders Front and the two conservative Islamic parties in Indonesia's House of Representatives, would go after him in terms of his religiosity and also in terms of his commitment to Islam more generally. Maruf Amin, to some degree, allows him to be insulated to some of those challenges, but more importantly, he allowed Widodo to court support from Indonesia's largest Islamic social organization, the Nahdlatul Ulama. And if you look at how Jokowi did in the provinces of Central and East Java, he increased his support, or the amount of vote that he got, by 10 percentage points, roughly 10 percentage points in both of those provinces. These are NU, Nahdlatul Ulama's strongholds. And I think that this allowed him actually to make up some of the lost support in Indonesia's Islamic or conservative heartland, where he seems to have done not quite as good.
Is he going to rule in a different manner?
I don't think so. I think that what we saw in terms of the trajectory of his first term was the first year really him trying to get to terms with presidential politics. His vice presidential candidate, or his vice president at that time, was specifically chosen to give him a very powerful figure who would be able to do a lot of the heavy lifting, if you will, in the early months. And then as his term developed, he became slightly more autocratic, less committed to the liberal ideals that he had during the election, more focused on the economy and infrastructure development. And I think this is a recipe for rule that he finds very comfortable. It's very pragmatic to some degree, and it is not hugely ideologically oriented. So I think that his consolidation of executive authority will continue, and he will mostly be the same. I don't think we'll see any changes in the way he'll rule, no.
Because I'm reading some analyses, Carlo Bonura, that say after that blasphemy trial for the governor of the former governor of Jakarta, Ahok, that it kind of spooked to a certain degree Joko Widodo, and that that's partly why he's picked an Islamist as his running mate.
I think that's correct, and I think that again, the way in which the Indonesian establishment with regard to Islam is structured is fairly complex. So we have these four Islamic parties two of which support Jokowi or Joko Widodo, and two of which supported Prabowo Subianto. The Indonesian Ulama Council, which is where Maruf Amin comes from, he's the head of the MUI. This is a very conservative organization, which in many ways has been openly critical of things like pluralism, secularism, and liberalism. And so, as I mentioned before, the Nahdlatul Ulama is not a conservative social organization, and yet it felt, I think, that its supporters would be more willing to support Widodo if he, in fact, picked Maruf Amin. So again, as I said, this is a very well calculated electoral strategy. And in some ways, in the run-up to the election, many people thought it would be Prabowo who would play the religion card, and he certainly did in terms of the rhetoric of his campaign and the way in which he framed his rallies. If we think about the rally that took place just on Sunday, which was organized around morning prayers. But in fact, the more successful strategy was the one taken by Jokowi, which was to look at the structure of Indonesian politics in terms of Muslim support and Islamic support, or an Islamic electorate. If we want to think about those voters who think about the election in religious terms. And it's clear that he made the right decision. Rather than to take potentially the low road of far more exclusive politics, he actually figured out where the constituencies were that he needed to target, and were successful.
And on that point, how are the constituencies changing? We're talking about a nation where more than 4 out of 10 people are under the age of 24. Is Indonesia becoming more socially conservative?
There is data and analysis across Southeast Asia that demonstrates that electorates across the region are becoming more socially conservative. And so if we suggest that Indonesia is becoming more socially conservative, it may not necessarily be related to Islam. In the post-Suharto period, when there's been broader freedoms of speech, broader freedoms of assembly, we have seen the substantial growth of Islamist activist groups, and also the development of new Islamic political parties. And with that comes growing calls for more conservative religiosity in Indonesia. So to think about whether or not young people in Indonesia are more religiously conservative, that we might not know for at least another 5 to 10 years. But currently, we're in a phase where Islam itself, public religion, is becoming more conservative. And the idea that Jokowi would go with a political fixer for his vice president in the first time around, and then a conservative Islamic cleric in the second election, demonstrates perhaps how much more important Islam is at the national level.
Carlo Bonura of the School of Oriental and African Studies, SOAS, many thanks for speaking with us here on France 24.